Marcus Reid adjusted the crisp cuffs of his tailored suit as he stepped out of his car, the faint hum of city life surrounding him. The day was bright, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing within him. At just 25 years old, Marcus was the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing tech startup. A college dropout turned entrepreneur, he had defied the odds and risen to success in a competitive, often exclusive industry. But success, as he was learning, didn't shield him from prejudice. Earlier that week, Marcus had closed the biggest deal of his career, a multi-million-dollar licensing agreement with a global corporation. The deal was a testament to years of late nights, countless rejections, and a determination born from the challenges of growing up in a low-income neighborhood. That morning, he had walked into his bank to deposit the first payment from the deal, a check worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. The bank, a modern glass and steel building that projected an air of sophistication, was a stark contrast to the world Marcus had grown up in. But to him, it was just another reminder of how far he'd come. He walked through the double doors and up to the counter, the check in hand and his heart light with pride. "Good morning," he said, sliding the check across the counter to the teller. The woman on the other side glanced at the check, her eyebrows raising slightly before she looked up at Marcus. Her eyes flicked briefly over his youthful face, his neatly styled hair, and his dark skin. Something shifted in her demeanor, subtle but unmistakable. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, taking the check and disappearing into a back room. Marcus waited patiently, scrolling through his phone. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the teller returned, her expression guarded. "There's an issue with this deposit," she said, her tone clipped. "We'll need to put a hold on your account while we verify the source of these funds." Marcus frowned, confusion washing over him. "A hold? Why? The check is legitimate. It's from a corporate account, and I've done business with them before." "It's just protocol," she replied, avoiding his gaze. He pressed further, but her answers remained vague. The situation escalated when the branch manager intervened, repeating the same vague assurances. Routine checks, fraud protection, and unusual activity were phrases that came up, but none of them addressed what Marcus suspected. He was being judged not for his success, but for who he was. Frustrated, Marcus left the bank, his account frozen and his pride bruised. He spent the rest of the day making calls to customer service, only to be told that the matter was under review. No one could give him a clear explanation, but the implication was painfully clear. Later that evening, Marcus sat at his sleek glass desk in his downtown apartment, staring at his laptop. His account, which held the hard-earned fruits of his labor, was still inaccessible. The insult of it all gnawed at him. Despite all he had accomplished, despite earning every cent in his account, he was still being treated as if he didn't belong. For Marcus, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a stark reminder of the systemic biases he had encountered his entire life. He thought back to the nights he spent coding in his cramped dorm room, dreaming of a brighter future. He remembered the investors who had dismissed him before he even got to pitch, their assumptions clear in their patronizing smiles. He thought of the professors who had doubted him, the landlords who questioned his ability to pay rent, and the stares he got whenever he drove his luxury car through certain neighborhoods. But Marcus wasn't one to back down. If the bank thought they could silence him with bureaucracy, they were mistaken. He pulled out his phone and began typing, his fingers moving with purpose. "Today, I was reminded that for some people, success has a color. My account was frozen, not because of fraud, but because someone couldn't believe that a young black man could legally have money. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that treats people of color as suspects, even when they've done nothing wrong." Within hours, Marcus's post had gone viral. Thousands of comments flooded in, sharing similar stories of racial profiling and discrimination. People rallied behind him, their outrage palpable. Prominent figures retweeted his message, and hashtags like "number wealth has no color" began trending. The media quickly picked up the story, turning Marcus into an unwitting spokesperson for an issue far bigger than himself. Yet, for Marcus, the fight was personal. This wasn't just about exposing injustice, it was about holding those responsible accountable. As Marcus closed his laptop that night, he felt a flicker of determination ignite. The bank had underestimated him, just as so many others had before. But Marcus Reid was no stranger to being underestimated, and this time, he intended to make sure the world noticed. By the next morning, Marcus's phone was buzzing incessantly. His viral post had been picked up by major news outlets. Reporters were requesting interviews, advocacy groups were reaching out, and social media was ablaze with discussions about racial discrimination in the banking system. What Marcus had initially shared as a personal frustration was quickly becoming a national conversation. He opened his inbox, scrolling through a sea of messages. One, in particular, caught his eye. An email from a well-known civil rights attorney named Adrienne Harper. Her subject line was direct and unyielding. "Let's fight this together." Marcus opened the email, intrigued. "Dear Mr. Reid, I read about your experience and want to express my support. This isn't just about you, it's about everyone who has been profiled and humiliated because of the color of their skin. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and discuss your legal options. Together, we can ensure that this bank and others like it face accountability." Marcus sat back in his chair, considering her offer. He wasn't one to rush into legal battles, but this wasn't the first time he'd been treated unfairly, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Adrienne's email felt like an opportunity to turn his frustration into something meaningful. He responded with a simple message: "Let's meet." Adrienne Harper was a force to be reckoned with. When Marcus met her in her Midtown office, her energy was palpable. She had spent years fighting cases of systemic discrimination, and her passion for justice burned brightly. "Your case is bigger than a frozen bank account," Adrienne began, leaning forward. "It's about a pattern. How financial institutions target young, successful Black individuals because their success doesn't fit the system's biased expectations." Marcus nodded, her words resonating deeply. Adrienne outlined her plan. They would file a lawsuit against the bank for racial discrimination, seeking damages for the financial and emotional toll their actions had taken. Additionally, they would demand transparency regarding the bank's policies, particularly the algorithms used to flag suspicious activity. "Algorithms aren't neutral," Adrienne explained. "They reflect the biases of the people who create them. If we expose how those biases are baked into the system, we can push for real change." Marcus agreed, his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about his experience. It was about ensuring no one else would have to endure the same humiliation. As news of the lawsuit spread, the bank's PR team scrambled to control the narrative. They released a carefully worded statement, expressing regret for the unfortunate misunderstanding and insisting that their actions were based solely on standard fraud prevention protocols. Marcus read the statement with a bitter laugh. "Standard fraud prevention protocols?" he muttered. "Is that what they call racial profiling now?" The bank's attempt to downplay the situation only fueled public outrage. Advocacy groups and activists doubled down on their support for Marcus, organizing protests outside the bank's headquarters. Customers began closing their accounts, using the hashtag #PoundBankOnBias to demand accountability. The pressure was mounting, and Marcus knew it was only the beginning. As the lawsuit progressed, Marcus used his platform to amplify the stories of others who had faced discrimination. He hosted live streams, sharing conversations with people from across the country who had been profiled by banks, stores, or institutions simply for being Black. One story in particular stood out: a young woman named Kayla, who had been denied a business loan despite her stellar credit and solid business plan. "They told me to try something more realistic," Kayla said, her voice trembling. "They didn't even look at my paperwork. They just assumed I couldn't succeed." Marcus listened intently, his anger simmering. Kayla's story, like so many others, reflected the pervasive biases that permeated the financial system. Determined to do more, Marcus partnered with a nonprofit organization focused on economic empowerment for marginalized communities. Together, they launched a campaign called "Wealth Has No Color," aimed at breaking down barriers in the financial world. The campaign gained traction quickly, with celebrities, influencers, and politicians lending their support. For Marcus, it was a way to turn his experience into something greater, a platform for systemic change. Months later, the lawsuit reached its critical phase. Marcus sat in the courtroom, flanked by Adrienne and her legal team. The bank's lawyers, a formidable group of well-dressed professionals, sat across the aisle. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the opening arguments began. Adrienne spoke with precision and passion, outlining how the bank's policies disproportionately targeted young, successful Black individuals. She presented evidence showing a pattern of flagged accounts that revealed glaring racial disparities. The bank's defense was predictable. They claimed their actions were purely procedural, driven by algorithms designed to detect fraud. But Adrienne was prepared. In a powerful cross-examination, she called a former employee of the bank to the stand. The employee, a whistleblower, testified that internal guidelines often encouraged staff to scrutinize accounts belonging to unexpected wealthy individuals, code for young people of color. When Adrienne revealed this, the courtroom fell silent. Marcus watched as the bank's lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. The tide was turning. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. The bank was found guilty of racial discrimination and ordered to pay significant damages to Marcus. But more importantly, the court mandated sweeping reforms. The bank was required to overhaul its fraud detection systems, ensuring they were free from racial bias. All employees would undergo mandatory diversity and inclusion training. The bank had to publicly disclose its internal policies, increasing transparency and accountability. As the verdict was read, Marcus felt a surge of vindication. He had stood up against a powerful institution and won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced or dismissed. With the lawsuit behind him, Marcus shifted his focus to the future. He used a portion of the settlement money to establish a fund that provided grants to underrepresented entrepreneurs. The fund, named after his late mother, aimed to break down the financial barriers that kept so many talented individuals from pursuing their dreams. Marcus also continued his advocacy work, pushing for legislative reforms to ensure greater accountability in the financial sector. His story had sparked a national movement, and he wasn't about to let the momentum fade. Months later, Marcus walked into a different bank, this time to open an account for his nonprofit. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he approached the counter, bracing himself for the familiar skepticism. But this time was different. The teller greeted him warmly, processed his request efficiently, and treated him with respect. As Marcus walked out of the bank, a sense of quiet triumph washed over him. Change was happening, not just for him, but for countless others. Marcus Reid sat in his office, the evening light casting a golden hue across the room. The lawsuit was behind him, the dust had settled, and his name had become synonymous with resilience and justice. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. The weight of everything he had endured, and the victories he had won, felt heavy. But it was a burden he carried with pride. His phone buzzed with a notification, another email from an aspiring entrepreneur seeking advice. Marcus smiled, setting it aside for the moment. He leaned back in his chair, thinking about how far he had come. From a young man with big dreams and little support, to a leader with a platform capable of enacting real change. It was a transformation even he hadn't fully anticipated. But the journey had never been about just him. The bank freezing his account wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. And while Marcus had triumphed in his personal battle, he knew the war against systemic injustice was far from over. A few weeks later, Marcus visited his old neighborhood, now the home of his nonprofit's first community center. The building buzzed with activity. Young entrepreneurs attended workshops on securing funding, while others networked with mentors in the tech industry. On one wall, a vibrant mural depicted people of diverse backgrounds working together, a symbol of the center's mission. As Marcus toured the space, he felt a familiar tug of emotion. This center was more than just a resource. It was a lifeline for people like him. Kids who had dreams but lacked the means to pursue them. In one corner, he met a teenager named Jamal, who had recently launched a small business selling handmade accessories. Jamal hesitated at first, clearly nervous about meeting Marcus, but eventually he opened up. "They told me I'd never make it," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But I kept going because, well, you did it. If you could, maybe I can too." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. "You can," he said, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "And you will. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." As he walked away, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the cyclical nature of success. The world had doubted him, but now his story was giving others the courage to believe in themselves. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to push for systemic reforms in the financial sector. His victory in court had set a precedent, but he wanted to ensure lasting change. He worked closely with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency and eliminating racial biases in banking practices. Marcus also partnered with other advocates to host a national summit on financial equity. The event brought together policymakers, business leaders, and community organizers to discuss actionable solutions for breaking down barriers in the industry. At the summit's closing panel, Marcus took the stage to deliver a speech. He shared his story, not just the pain, but the triumph, the lessons learned, and the vision for the future. "The system wasn't built for people like me," Marcus said, his voice steady yet impassioned. "But that doesn't mean we can't change it. If we keep pushing, keep holding people accountable, we can create a world where success isn't determined by the color of your skin, but by the strength of your ideas." The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that felt like validation, not for Marcus's journey alone, but for the countless others who had walked similar paths. Months later, Marcus received a letter from the same bank that had frozen his account. The envelope, embossed with the bank's logo, felt heavier than it should. He opened it cautiously, scanning the contents. The letter contained an official apology from the CEO, acknowledging the bank's failure and committing to ongoing reforms. They expressed regret for the harm caused, not just to Marcus, but to others who had faced similar injustices. It wasn't everything Marcus had hoped for, but it was a start. The fact that a powerful institution had been forced to admit fault was a small but significant victory in a much larger fight. One sunny afternoon, Marcus visited a different bank to speak with the staff as part of a new initiative his nonprofit had launched. The goal was to educate financial institutions on the importance of equitable practices and to share strategies for creating more inclusive environments. As he walked into the branch, he noticed a young teller watching him nervously. Her expression reminded him of the day he walked into the first bank, full of optimism, only to be dismissed. This time, he greeted her warmly, explaining why he was there. By the end of the session, the staff was engaged and inspired, and Marcus left feeling hopeful. Change was slow, but it was happening. Back at his office, Marcus stared at the framed photo on his desk, a picture of his late mother, who had always encouraged him to dream big. He thought about everything he had achieved and everything still left to do. His nonprofit was expanding, his advocacy work was gaining traction, and his company continued to thrive. But for Marcus, the most meaningful victories were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars or accolades. They were the moments when someone like Jamal found the courage to keep going, when a policy changed because of his fight, or when someone walked into a bank and was treated with the dignity they deserved. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Marcus made a silent vow to himself to keep pushing, to keep fighting, and to keep building a world where no one was ever made to feel like they didn't belong. Because for Marcus Reid, success wasn't just about proving people wrong, it was about lifting others up.